Spanning the globe, it's World Affairs Roundup.
The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents World Affairs Roundup, a monthly edition of International Focus providing opinion and analysis of global events, with John Katzka, a retired member of the U.S. Foreign Service, Ann Hamilton, political scientist at UW-Whitewater who also served in the U.S. Foreign Service, and Robert Kraig, executive director of Citizen Action of Wisconsin and author of articles and books on American foreign policy. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now, here's your moderator, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus and another edition of our World Affairs Roundup. Ann Hamilton is out on assignment, but Roundup regulars John Katzka and Robert Kraig are here to take a New Year's look at two sets of issues likely to preoccupy leaders and shape our world in 2015. First, nationalism. Not so long ago, many people assumed the forces we collectively call globalization had set in motion an inexorable movement towards integration, rendering national borders and the identities they reflected less relevant. Across the globe in 2014, however, nationalism mounted an often noisy comeback. What does this phenomenon suggest for global politics in the coming year? We'll also look at the state of the global economy. With oil prices in free fall, growing global income inequality, China's economy slowing, and Europe bracing for deflation, 2015 could be a bumpy ride. How will the new year impact bottom lines around the world? Well, gentlemen, Happy New Year. Welcome back.
Happy New Year to you and to our viewers.
Well, John, I wonder if you could take a first swing at what happened in the 90s to our borderless world that was just on the horizon.
You know, there were the pundits in the 90s who looked at this, at the world, and we were moving into the information age, and they were saying, well, it's the time for international organizations. We had the World Trade Organization. We've had the G20. The UN hasn't necessarily kept up with the times, but the G20 was a way in which to get around some of the limitations of the UN system. And all of a sudden, and this almost what makes one become an economic determinist, when the economics get bad, then other things come up. And nationalism is on the rise. And you know, there's a wonderful, maybe it's not a wonderful, symmetry between the two topics we're talking about the rise of nationalism and about the economic situation in the world today. And maybe I'll just leave that there and let Robert come in.
Well, Robert, before you do that, I've got one quote that might sort of frame what we mean by nationalism. This is from Charles de Gaulle. You can take a look at that. He says, patriotism is when love of your own people comes first. Nationalism when hate for people other than your own comes first. So is that what we're seeing today?
Well, I think from an academic standpoint, excessive love of your own people also would be a form of nationalism if you think of it historically and if you think about how it's defined. Obviously, the death of nationalism was overhyped, oversold, and that's always what happens when something new occurs. There was a new development of international organizations and all sorts of new structures that it then gets overdetermined, and you start to say, like we used to say, there was a claim there'd be an end of ideology after the Cold War, which of course is not the case either, or that somehow we're leading to a secular world, which has not been the case, even though it's been in some pockets. So I don't think nationalism ever really went away. The Balkan Wars were obviously a horrendous outpouring of nationalism. And quite frankly, there was a nationalist reaction in the U.S. to 9/11, just for example. But I think John's right, as we get into more and more economic insecurity and uncertainty, national feeling, which is still there, those nationalist ties are still there, is coming up in a lot of different contexts. And Russia, driving a lot of Russia's activities. Depends how you define it. A lot of people, there are some people who would view what ISIS is doing as a form of nationalism. Those who would not see it as a form of nationalism, depends on a definition. But there's certainly a lot of nationalism driving conflict. There's a lot of anti-immigration feeling both in the United States and in Europe that is partly driven by the economy, partly driven by the fact that there's still still a lot of the old national feeling. It wasn't abolished. And quite frankly, the international organizations have not caused the kind of human attachment. You don't see people running around saying, cheering on the WTO at the World Cup, for example, right?
Or the EU bureaucracy.
Right, the EU bureaucracy doesn't have a World Cup team, right? You can imagine. So it doesn't cause that level of attachment anymore. And so it's understandable. Now, it hasn't gone as far as some people thought. Some people thought we would have countries breaking off. Scotland came surprisingly close to breaking off in the UK, but didn't. We have other dominoes like that. But I think nationalism never really went away, but current conditions certainly show that how important it is and how much it's going to be driving foreign policy and world politics in 2015 and beyond.
Well, let's just kind of take a quick stroll around the world, if you will. John, talk a little bit about the pushback against the EU.
Yes. Brussels has a fairly bad eye in most of Europe right now. Partly it's because what they are trying to do is homogenize all of the cultural values that all of these countries have. And again, economics plays into this. If Europe was doing splendidly right now, and I could say the same for Ukraine and a whole bunch of other places, we wouldn't see the level of unhappiness that we're seeing now. But it's about the EU bureaucracy. It's about the requirements that the EU is laying down on the respective countries in terms of getting their economies in order, largely pushed by Germany in that direction. It's the undoing of the social framework that many of these countries have developed over decades, even over the last 100 years. And some of this they can no longer afford, and they're having to dismantle some of this, and there's pushback on all this. And then I'll add one more point, and I see this in the context as a futurist as also the impact of the information age, where you have new winners and losers, and you have new values coming on. And much of what we're seeing in terms of the nationalistic fervor is a pushback against the immigrants, against the free flow of Europeans across the EU, and it's against them as opposed to us.
So, Robert, we've seen in many countries the rise of once marginal sort of ultra-nationalist right-wing parties. How far do you think that could go?
Depends on the economy in part, but look, I mean, if you think about it, the new internationalism in many ways helped spark the new nationalism. Not to insult Theodore Roosevelt. It's not. He meant it in a good way. That term. But if you're Greece and the Greek people, and you've had liberalization and austerity foisted upon you because of your threat to the EU, well, now your movement to try to undo that becomes a nationalist movement. It becomes, you define yourself against Brussels, right? So the EU makes a resurgence in Greek nationalism possible. The problem is that the far right-wing or far left-wing parties, it's actually either one, right, that are nationalist in orientation, benefit from this. So it's a question of whether the mainline parties try to position themselves to adopt some of these principles and start to be a place where some of that public sentiment can funnel into, or whether they don't. You only challenge the major parties if you don't create any outlet for that public opinion. It is an issue in India and other places in Asia, this is the case as well, that the people are now involved. In Vietnam, where you've had riots over sovereignty issues in the South China Sea with China, once the people are involved, it becomes much more politically sticky. It's not just about politicians and their posturing, it's about their own bases and constituencies.
And you raise a point in there that I think we should elaborate on, and that's much of the unhappiness is not just in Europe, is not just against Brussels, it's against the existing elites within the country. There's an unhappiness because there's a feeling that they have mismanaged both the economic and the political fronts. And as we know, the National Front in France is now the largest party, as is the UKIP UK Independence Party, the largest party. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to come into power, because they'll probably be, the existing parties are probably going to do some accommodating to be able to put together a coalition government. But it is against the established elites that much of this is being focused on.
Well, let's jump to a different part of the world. What about Japan, for example, and the Abe government? How does that play into this rise of nationalism?
Well, Abe in Japan, Xi Jinping in China, and Modi in India are all manifestations of this growing nationalist opinion. Now, there's a very awkward component to this that we may come up against, and it almost draws parallels between the period of the Great Depression, more so than the 1990s, that some pundits have been pointing back to. As this approximates that, because what we're doing as the economic conditions deteriorate, people are beginning to turn the wagons into a circle, and they're out against everyone who's doesn't look exactly like them. That was kind of what happened in World War II.
Well, one of the things that we heard a lot previously, when there was sort of a more triumphalist approach to this multipolar world, was the problems are now so complex that no single national entity can deal with them. We need these multilateral approaches. What does this new nationalism do to that?
It's a very good question. I mean, it complicates it. For sure. The difference between now and the 30s, I agree with John, there's a similarity, is in the 30s there was a real question, since it became fascism outright, whether or not liberal democracy could work anymore, whether it could solve problems at this scale. And so the 30s and early 40s sort of, it was much more in doubt than people realize today. But you have a situation now, the more people are sort of mobilized against these international structures, the harder it is. Not that I want to defend all of them. Some of them need to be reformed, quite frankly. You need to have actual labor standards, for example, in the global trade regime, which we don't have. That would actually help, I think, a lot. But it is scary if you look at Asia. I mean, some people have compared Abe's government and the connections to a Tea Party in Japan, and the kind of flashpoint that could be with China, with Korea. They literally want to revisit the question of whether Japan actually did commit certain kinds of atrocities, et cetera, and whether or not the Japanese invasion of most of Asia before World War II really was damaging or not. That will spark ultranationalism in China, in Korea, for example.
Well,
and so it's problematic.
And you have a number of areas where there are tensions, the South China Sea, for one, where there are a number of countries who have reasonable or unreasonable claims to territory there. You have the former Yugoslavia, which is where there is lots of covetousness amongst the neighbors there. The Hungarian Empire that has been broken up, and they've been made to behave themselves because they're part of the EU now. All of these things are kind of percolating under the surface, and the worse things get, the more likely they're going to rise up. And we didn't even talk about Ukraine and Russia in this process.
Right. Well, we're going to take a short break, but after we come back, we'll talk about the other side of this coin, and that's the state of the global economy. And so we'll see how one is affecting the other, or is it a cycle we're locked into? But first, we'll take a short break.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We're talking with John Katzka and Robert Kraig about nationalism and the state of the global economy. So, Robert, some people have said 2015 could be a fork in the road for the world economy. And what do they mean, do you think?
Well, the economic indicators are mixed, to say the least. So the United States is actually, relatively speaking, growing. There's growing economic inequality in the U.S., but there's job creation at a level we haven't seen since the 1990s. China is trying to moderate its growth to become more of a consumer economy, quite frankly, but still will be much more, they consider moderate growth to be 7.58%. But then the EU is very stagnant. Germany, very stagnant, for example. And Russia, both because of the sanctions and because of the decline in the cost of oil, actually is looking at negative growth. And so the world as a whole is going to grow, but it's very uneven, with certainly oil-producing countries or countries that depend upon commodities losing a lot of ground, and therefore leading to some of the unrest that'll lead to nationalist movements, as John suggests. And there's a real question of whether the U.S. recovery can continue if you have a global slowdown. In other words, it can't really work as an island, so that may also slow down the U.S. economy. So I would say that there's a great deal of economic uncertainty, and I don't think that there's a real model out there. That is to say, we really are in the situation where we're trying to ride the tide of various fiscal policies, dealing with various debt issues. But at the same time, I don't feel that the international organizations we've talked about have created a blueprint for prosperity. And by the way, they've been focused mostly on GNP growth and not about the inequality issue at all.
Well, people have made the parallels, again, as in our previous story, to the late 90s, where the U.S. growth is outpacing the rest of the world. Japan and Germany, the other big economies, are relatively weak. There's trouble in emerging markets. But the one wild card I think that's very different, and Robert, you alluded to this, is China. Now, what is the impact of China trying to make that switch to be more domestic, demand-driven?
If you look at it in a broad sense, it looks fairly simple. China shifts from being a massive exporter to becoming, as I think, a more comfortable nation, a more mature nation in the next decade. But underneath that, there are lots of complications. There's the coastal versus the interior. There's the urban versus the rural. There's the party versus a lot of entrepreneurs who aren't interested in their rules. There's the ethnic issues in China as well. All of that complicates the picture. There were economists said that China needed to grow at 8% in order to be able to maintain a stable social structure within China. Well, they're below 8% now. And there hasn't been a collapse, but there are lots of tensions.
So one of the things that we've seen is an ever-strengthening dollar. And I think for many people, they would think, well, that's good, isn't it? Don't we like strong dollars? What are some of the negative impacts of the dollar appreciating too much against other currencies?
Well, it makes our exports more expensive. And so the United States has had a comeback in manufacturing, partly because there's been insourcing of manufacturing because wages have gone down so far since deunionization. So they've went out and then come back. I mean, but if you have too strong a dollar, then you can't export very much at all because it just increases the cost of it. So these all have repercussions, right? There's some impact in the U.S. economy in the boom areas with oil. With oil potentially, it's under $50 a barrel, could go down to $30 a barrel, which is destabilizing at some level, even though it's estimated it will overall increase world growth and U.S. growth. It's very unequal. It'll damage other countries.
Actually, I think this is a bad indicator to pick on in terms of the betterment of the world's economy. Because first of all, Saudi Arabia sits on the flow, and they're doing it for political reasons, either or, but probably both, to deal with Iran and Syria and to punish them in terms of their markets, but also to punish Canada and the United States for our investments into the shale.
Right.
Well, and that truly was a sea change, potentially, right?
That's right.
And
so
the U.S. be
sudden,
a net exporter of energy.
Right. And so Saudi Arabia can decide at any time to
Right.
to turn the spigot off or to slow it down, and then all of a sudden we're groping for a new normalization in the process.
They'll want to, and this is what you did when a country dumped, right, and internally or externally. You want to wait until you've dried up the investment. So you've got to make sure that Canada has now pulled out the investment on the tar sands. Then you turn around and you raise it. It also actually, and this is probably not the intent because it's too long term, but it undermines alternative energy dramatically, which we need to convert to in order to in order to limit the impact of a global warming catastrophe.
we see behaviorally, 2014 was a banner year for the sale of trucks and other very large vehicles.
Highest since the 90s, which you mentioned before.
So, John, let's talk a little bit about your old stomping grounds and how this oil situation affects Russia.
Very seriously. And first of all, I would say, tying it in with what's happening in the EU, expect that the EU is going to begin to put pressure on us to lower the sanctions on Russia simply because of their concern that this will grow, the economic and then the political turmoil there will get out of hand. And there's two ways in which that can go.
This is my question. Does this perilous situation that the crash in oil prices meets out on Russia tame the bear and make them more likely, or does it feed our earlier topic of nationalism?
It's already fed the nationalists. The Russian people have rallied around Putin more so than been upset with what he has pulled them into.
So one other phenomenon that seems to be looming on the horizon is actual deflation in Europe. And talk a little bit about why that's bad.
Well, I mean, it's ironic because we usually talk about inflation as a problem, but economists would agree that deflation is far more dangerous than inflation.
Look at Japan.
And explain why.
Well, what happens with deflation is you think the good is going to be cheaper, so you don't buy it. In other words, if you think literally the refrigerator is going to cost you $200 less in a year, you hold on, and that occurs with everything as far as
Nobody buys the refrigerators.
Right.
The refrigerator plant lays off people.
So it's a natural austerity plan, even though it would seem to be good that goods are cheaper. From a standpoint of economic growth and prosperity, it's not. And so, and by the way, wages deflate as well. So it's not as if it's not exactly necessarily wealth creation.
And that's already occurring, both here and
it is here. In fact, the latest economic numbers that came out this week, we had a lot of jobs growth, as economists had hoped, but they're very concerned that the increase in wages actually reversed, and wages continue to decline in the United States in the last quarter.
Now, it depends upon what your point of view is on this, because there's winners and losers in that process.
I agree. I do think, because we talked about having a consumer economy in China, that we have a problem in the U.S. that most of the income gain in the recovery has gone to the wealthiest, and that eventually damages dramatically the consumer economy. It's being propped up again by debt, but we know how dangerous that is.
So, what about the impact, getting back again to the strong dollar, on the emerging markets? I mean, a lot of their debt is delineated in dollars, right?
And there's another issue related to that, and this is where you got to watch countries like Turkey and Indonesia and Brazil. I forgot the name of what we call them.
The BRIC?
The BRICS.
Yes.
Because South Africa and South Korea could fit into that category as well. And those countries received, while we were entrenching, Main Street was entrenching, Wall Street was doing quite well, and because Wall Street was investing in all of these other markets. Well, those markets have been overextended now, and you have to watch to see what's going to happen there as part of a trigger for further action down the road.
So let's tie these two phenomena together then. So what is the correlation between the state of the economy and the nationalism that we talked to earlier?
I think that there is a parallel between the two. They move together. but I also think that the nationalism is also a resistance to change that's coming inevitably as we move into the information age, deeper into the information age. I see it in the United States, both in the labor unions and in the social conservatives, as a resistance to the change as well. So what the nationalism we're seeing in Europe is a part of that resistance, I see.
Well, if you're making your decisions based on ideology, be it nationalism or whatever your ism is of choice, does that affect your ability to make the kinds of decisions that really would be beneficial when you're in tough economic times?
Quite frankly, nationalism affects mass psychology, and so that constrains policymakers. And so nationalism could be a symptom when you have economic stress, and not just people being in economic trouble, but just fear and anxiety, right? Then nationalism is a way of explaining it. People need simple explanations, causal explanations as to what is going on. So a lot of people in Europe can say the causal explanation is immigrants coming in from North Africa or the Middle East, or they can say it's Germany riding herd on destroying our own national sovereignty and the proud Greek and Spanish and Italian tradition. So it becomes a clear causal explanation and a way to get even more emotional. So I think it does limit policymakers, and because they will lose out. If they don't address those emotions at all, then fringe parties could take over, and so they will try to find a way to at least express them and represent them in some fashion, even while trying to divert them.
As usual, we've run out of time before we've run out of commentary, but it'll be a bumpy ride in any case. We'll look forward to watching it with you and our viewers. We hope you'll join us next time. See you again.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,